Rain fell hard over the city that night, and a young man lay dying in an alley, blood pooling beneath him on the wet stone. His name was Yin Yu Tian, and an hour earlier he had been an ordinary college student. Now his chest barely rose. His vision blurred at the edges, and through the pain, something strange floated in front of his eyes. A pale blue window, words hanging in the dark, asking him a question no dying man should ever see. Accept structural restoration? He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know if he was hallucinating from blood loss, or dying, or both. But some instinct, some stubborn refusal to leave a question unanswered, made him reach toward it. To understand how he got here, the story has to go back 1 hour. Yin Yu Tian was not the kind of person who got into fights. He was the kind of person who checked a locked door 3 times before he could leave his apartment, who couldn't sleep if his shoes weren't lined up perfectly at the foot of his bed, who felt something close to physical pain when a picture frame hung crooked on a wall. His mind ran on order. Break that order, and something in him screamed. That afternoon he was crossing the university plaza when he saw it, a proposal in progress. A wealthy student named Wu Fan had laid out 1,000 red roses in the shape of a heart, preparing to ask Fan Sui Shu, the heir to one of the city's ruling clans, to be his girlfriend. A crowd had gathered. Phones were out, recording, but the roses were uneven. One side of the heart curved wider than the other, petals scattered where they shouldn't. To anyone else, it was a romantic gesture. To Yin Yu Tian, it was an open wound. He didn't decide to walk over, his feet simply moved. He knelt in front of 1,000 roses and began fixing them, petal by petal, ignoring Wu Fan's stunned face and the murmurs rippling through the crowd. He wasn't trying to ruin anything. In his mind, he was helping. The lines needed to match. The shape needed to be perfect. Wu Fan didn't see it that way. He grabbed Yin Yu Tian by the collar and demanded to know what he thought he was doing, humiliating him in front of the girl he loved, in front of half the campus. Yin Yu Tian tried to explain, but the words came out wrong. Too calm, too focused on the roses, and not on the growing rage in front of him. The first punch landed on his jaw. Fan Sui Shu tried to step between them, but Wu Fan's friends closed the gap around Yin Yu Tian, pulling him away from the roses and into the alley behind the plaza. What happened there wasn't a fight. It was a beating. Fists and boots, one after another, while he curled up and took it, his mind somehow still cataloging the uneven brick pattern on the alley wall even as blood filled his mouth. By the time they were done, Fan Sui Shu had already fled to bring help. She returned with security guards minutes later. There was no one in the alley, no blood on the stones, no sign anyone had been hurt at all. That absence would matter later. For now, the story stays with the boy bleeding out under a system window that shouldn't exist. He didn't remember accepting the prompt. He remembered waking up in his own bed, sunlight cutting through the blinds, his body aching in ways that made no sense for someone who was supposedly fine. And floating at the edge of his vision, refusing to disappear no matter how hard he blinked, was a small red icon. Task incomplete. He tried to swipe it away. He tried closing his eyes. He tried pressing his palms against his eyelids until he saw spots. The icon stayed, small and insistent, like an email he couldn't delete. For most people, an unexplained floating notification appearing in their vision would be terrifying. For Yin Yu Tian, it was something worse. It was unfinished. And unfinished things did not let him rest. He opened the panel just to see what it wanted. Quest: master the basic left uppercut. Progress: 0%. He had never thrown a punch in his life before the alley. He didn't know why a fighting system had chosen him, of all people. A boy who alphabetized his spice rack. But the red icon sat there, blinking, demanding closure, and closure was the one thing Yin Yu Tian could never say no to. So he trained. All night, alone in his cramped apartment, throwing the same punch at a pillow propped against the wall, adjusting his stance a fraction of an inch, each time something felt off. Most people would have quit after 20 minutes of sore knuckles. He kept going past 2 in the morning, chasing a percentage number instead of any real goal. Somewhere past midnight, his knuckles stopped aching and started to burn, a low, humming warmth that spread up his arm with each strike. The pillow, when he checked it, had a fist-shaped dent punched clean through the stuffing. The percentage read 100%. The icon vanished. For the first time since the beating, something inside him unclenched. Not triumph, just relief. The kind of relief you feel when the last item on a to-do list finally gets checked off. He didn't know yet that the warmth in his fists was real power. He didn't know that a hidden system built entirely around his compulsions had just started rewriting the rules of his life. He only knew, distantly, that the itch in his chest was gone, and he could finally sleep. The next day, his classmate Wei Wei found him in the cafeteria staring at a tray of food with visible distress. She had known him since they were children, long enough to understand his habits without needing an explanation. She watched him rearrange his fries into 2 even rows before he'd touch a single one, and instead of laughing at him the way most people did, she just slid her own tray over and helped him balance the portions. She'd always done this, quietly making room for the parts of him that other people mocked. She never asked him to change, she simply adjusted the world around him until it fit. When he tried to thank her for the food, guilt crept into his voice. He hated owing anyone anything, hated the imbalance of a debt he couldn't immediately repay. She just told him to relax and finish eating. Later that day, walking past an arcade, he stopped at a claw machine stuffed with plush toys, all piled at careless angles. He fed it a coin, not for the prize, but because the crooked pile offended him on a level he couldn't ignore. Something about the recent all-nighter had sharpened his hands, and each pull of the claw came out exact, calculated, perfect. Toy after toy dropped into the tray until the machine sat empty, and the shop owner stared at him like he'd found a crack in the game itself. He gave most of the toys to Wei Wei to settle the debt from lunch. It wasn't a large price. It was the only kind of currency his mind could accept. He thought that was the end of it. He was wrong. Wu Fan hadn't forgotten the humiliation from the day before, and word had already spread that the quiet, strange boy who fixed flowers had somehow walked away from a beating that should have put him in a hospital bed. Rather than let the story make him look weak, Wu Fan decided to finish what his friends had started, cornering Yin Yutian in an empty restroom between classes, with 3 of his usual companions blocking the door. This time, something in Yin Yutian's vision flickered before the first punch even landed. Quest updated. Uppercut level 1 unlocked. Novice glove equipped. A faint shimmer of light wrapped around his knuckles, gone as fast as it came. He didn't understand what it meant. He understood a moment later, when Wu Fan swung first, and Yin Yutian's fist met him halfway, sending him crashing into a bathroom stall, hard enough to crack the door off its hinge. The other 3 hesitated. That hesitation cost them. Yin Yutian moved through them with the same focus he used organizing his desk, each strike landing with unnatural precision, each opponent folding before they could fully process what was happening. It was over in seconds. Wu Fan groaned from inside the broken stall, one hand pressed to his ribs, refusing to believe what had just happened to him. Nobody in that restroom understood what they'd just witnessed. They saw an F-rank nobody suddenly hit like a trained fighter. They didn't know about the notifications, the percentages, the invisible war being fought inside his own skull every single day. That gap between what people saw and what was actually happening would only widen from here. News of the fight reached the Fan family faster than Yin Yutian expected. Rather than expel him, as he assumed would happen, Fan Suishu personally arranged for him to be tested at the family's private hunter facility, curious about a nobody who'd apparently put 4 students in the infirmary without breaking a sweat. The testing chamber used advanced scanning technology that measured a person's awakening rank the moment they stepped inside. Warriors, mages, archers, healers, whatever your bloodline carried, the machine read it instantly and stamped a rank on you for life. F at the bottom, S at the very top, reserved for fewer than 10 people on the entire planet. The machine read Yin Yutian and returned a single, unremarkable letter, F rank, lowest tier. Statistics barely above an untrained civilian. The technicians barely looked twice. Just another disappointing draw in a hunter family that mostly attracted disappointing draws. What none of them realized was that the machine was built to measure a different kind of power entirely. A bloodline gift passed down through awakening. It had no way to read a floating system built from one boy's compulsive need to finish what he started. His actual strength lived somewhere the scanner couldn't reach. So the file on him read, F rank, weak, unremarkable, assigned to the beginner track with the rest of the washouts. Under that label, Yin Yutian was placed into a squad of low-ranked trainees and dropped into a training simulator built to resemble a monster-infested underground city. A controlled environment where injuries triggered emergency teleportation instead of actual death. The squad leader, a loud, arrogant D-rank named Zhang Quan, made it clear from the first day that he considered babysitting an F-ranker beneath him. For 4 straight days, while the rest of the squad rotated through easier drills, Yin Yu Tian was assigned the short sword and the axe, basic melee weapons nobody expected an F-ranker to master. He didn't complain. Complaining wasn't in his nature. What was in his nature was an unbearable itch every time his proficiency number sat at anything less than 100%. He drilled forms until his hands blistered, then drilled through the blisters. He watched senior hunters spar in the yard and unconsciously mimic their footwork down to the smallest shift of weight, his system quietly logging every observed movement and folding it into his growing skill set. By the 4th day, his short sword form had gone from clumsy swings to something closer to a dance, clean and economical, though nobody bothered to watch an F-ranker long enough to notice. Zhang Quan noticed only enough to sneer about it during formation, telling the others not to bother learning from him and to save their energy for hunters who actually mattered. The dungeon simulator deep beneath the city held a D-rank undead general, an enemy meant for squads with proper rank clearance, not a training exercise for green recruits. Something in the facility's schedule had gone wrong that week, an oversight nobody caught until the squad was already inside the tunnel and the general's tomb had opened ahead of them. The creature rose from its stone coffin wrapped in rotted armor, its eyes burning a pale, sickly green. One sweep of its blade sent Zhang Quan crashing into the tunnel wall, his body locking rigid from a paralytic curse before the simulator's emergency system yanked him out entirely. The rest of the squad didn't wait to see what came next. They ran, leaving Yin Yu Tian alone in the dark, with a boss meant to kill hunters twice his rank. He didn't run. Not out of courage, exactly. His mind had already fixed on the fight in front of him the same way it fixed on a crooked picture frame, and walking away from something unfinished simply wasn't an option his brain allowed. The general's curse caught him across the shoulder, and ice spread through his veins, locking his joints one by one. His vision blurred at the edges the same way it had in that rainy alley, and for a moment he thought this was how it ended, alone in a fake dungeon that could apparently still kill him for real. Then his system flared to life. Vitals critical. Inner strength unlocked. Warmth exploded through his chest, burning away the paralysis like frost under a flame. His stats surged, an emergency response built entirely around pushing him to the edge of death before rewarding him with a burst of power most hunters trained years to unlock. He felt his short sword grow lighter in his grip, felt his focus sharpen until every gap in the general's rotted armor stood out like a lit path. He moved before he consciously decided to. The blade found the seam at the creature's neck, and with one clean strike, driven by a technique he'd absorbed just from watching senior hunters spar for 4 days, the undead general's head split cleanly in two. Skill acquired. Transcendent art of fencing. The body crumbled to ash. The simulator's exit portal shimmered open, and Yin Yu Tian walked out of a fight meant to kill him, calmly checking his palms for splinters, as if he'd just finished mopping a floor rather than beheading a boss 3 ranks above his own. Zhang Quan was waiting outside the portal, already spinning a story for the instructors about a malfunctioning simulator and an impossible enemy, conveniently leaving out the part where he abandoned his squad. He didn't expect the F-ranker to walk out at all, let alone walk out fine. Fan Suishu had come down personally to review the incident report, and she listened to Zhang Quan's excuses with a flat, unimpressed expression until Yin Yu Tian calmly corrected the record, describing exactly how the squad had left him behind. The footage from the simulator backed him up completely. Zhang Quan's face went pale. Whatever he'd expected from a friendless F-ranker, it wasn't a level, factual account that ended his career on the spot. Fan Suishu didn't hesitate. She stripped Zhang Quan of his post and had security escort both him and the corrupt training instructor off the grounds, their protests trailing behind them uselessly. It was the kind of moment Yin Yu Tian should have felt something about. Vindication, maybe pride. Instead, his attention snagged on Fan Suishu's collar, one side folded slightly higher than the other, and before he could stop himself he was explaining, in complete seriousness, exactly how to fix it. She stared at him for a long second, caught somewhere between offense and disbelief, before something like a laugh escaped her. Nobody had ever corrected her wardrobe in front of an audience of security guards. Nobody had ever looked at her like a puzzle instead of an heiress either. It was a small moment. It wouldn't stay small for long. Word of the F-ranker who'd solo killed a D-rank boss and gotten a squad leader fired spread through the Fan family's lower ranks fast, distorted a little more with each retelling. Most people assumed it was exaggeration. A few started paying closer attention. One of those people was the Fan family's adopted son, Fan Chunui, a decorated B-rank hunter groomed for years to inherit the corporation. On paper, he had every reason to be pleased that his family had discovered a promising new asset. In practice, every rising talent in the Fan household was one more obstacle standing between him and the seat he'd spent his whole life positioning himself for. What nobody in the family knew, what only Fan Chunui carried behind his calm, dutiful smile, was that his loyalty had never belonged to the Fans at all. Born under a different name, sent in years ago as a long-game asset for a rival corporation, he'd spent his entire life waiting for the right moment to move against the family that raised him. An F-ranker with a hidden system nobody could scan for wasn't just an inconvenience to his inheritance. He was a variable Fan Chunui didn't understand, and variables he didn't understand had a way of getting removed before they became real problems. He began making calls that night, quietly assembling a squad for an upcoming training dungeon, one low enough in rank that nobody would think twice about who got assigned to it, and dangerous enough that an accident wouldn't raise many questions. Yin Yutian had no idea any of this was happening. He went home that evening satisfied in the small, specific way that only came from finishing every task on his list, unaware that clearing a dungeon boss and correcting an heiress's collar had just put a target on his back that would follow him far deeper than any tunnel he'd walked out of so far. Orchestrated narrative arc across 5 pivotal story moments. Orchestrated narrative arc across 5 pivotal story moments. A week passed before the next assignment came through, and this one arrived with a different weight to it. Not a simulator, a real dungeon, out past the eastern gate, an E-rank tunnel infested with worm-type monsters that fed on heat and burrowed through stone like it was soft clay. Yin Yutian had expected another dismissive squad leader. What he got instead was a team led by 2 hunters he'd never met, both unusually polite, both a little too eager to reassure him this would be an easy first outing. One of them was a healer named Lanchimo, soft-spoken, quick to smile, the kind of presence that made a room feel safer just by standing in it. He didn't know she answered to Fan Chunui. He didn't know the assignment had been arranged specifically for him, or that the tunnel's deepest section held a natural chasm the squad had already scouted as a convenient place for accidents. The dungeon itself started ordinary enough. Worms the size of delivery trucks erupted from the tunnel walls at intervals, and Yin Yutian's blade work, still sharpening itself with every swing, made short work of the first few waves. His system logged each kill, nudging a new proficiency bar upward, and for a while, the squad's forced smiles almost looked genuine. Then the tunnel opened into a wide cavern, and the floor simply ended. A guide rope ran along the cavern wall, standard safety procedure for a drop this deep. Lanchimo asked Yin Yutian to check the anchor point first, since he'd apparently developed a habit for noticing when things weren't secured properly. He knelt at the edge without hesitation, running his fingers over the bolt, checking the tension the way he checked every lock in his apartment 3 times before trusting it. That focus was exactly what she'd been counting on. She hummed a soft, unbothered tune as her boot met his shoulder, and the shove sent him over the edge before his mind had finished processing the sound of her voice. The fall swallowed him whole, darkness rushing past on every side, no floor visible below. Panic should have taken over. Instead, some cold, functional part of his brain did the math on falling speed and distance the same way it calculated symmetry, and his hand shot out, driving his short sword into the rock wall beside him. Sparks flew as the blade dragged against stone, slowing his fall in violent, jarring bursts, his shoulders screaming with each impact. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't controlled, but by the time his boots finally hit solid ground, he was alive, bruised down one whole side of his body, breathing hard in a chamber nobody above him believed existed. Lanchimo would report a clean kill. She had no reason to think otherwise. He lay still for a long moment, letting the pain settle, letting his system quietly patch the worst of the damage. When he finally sat up, he realized the chamber wasn't empty rock. Old carvings lined the walls, faded symbols circling a stone altar at the center, and on that altar sat a shallow bowl, tilted a few careless degrees off-center. Under different circumstances, a stranded hunter with a dislocated shoulder might have ignored a crooked bowl in favor of finding an exit. Yin Yutian wasn't built for different circumstances. He crossed the chamber, ignoring the ache in his ribs, and adjusted the bowl until it sat dead center on the altar. The carvings lit up gold from the inside out, and a section of the far wall slid open with a low grinding sound, revealing a passage that hadn't existed a moment earlier. Whatever ancient mechanism guarded this place had apparently been waiting for someone patient enough, or compulsive enough, to notice the imbalance. The passage led down into a wider cavern-webbed floor-to-ceiling in thick, glistening strands, and at the center of that web sat something the size of a delivery truck itself, multiple eyes catching the faint glow of the chamber's crystal deposits. A spider queen. D rank, according to the readout that flickered across his vision, guarding a hoard of raw magic crystals worth more than most hunters earned in a year. He didn't get the chance to plan an approach. The moment he stepped fully into the chamber, silk fired from the shadows and wrapped around his limbs before he could react, yanking him off his feet and pinning him against a support pillar thick with old webbing. The queen descended slowly, almost curious, before driving a barbed leg into his side, injecting something that spread through his veins like liquid fire. Poison. Not the kind that killed quickly, but the kind that unraveled a body from the inside, muscle by muscle, nerve by nerve. His vision blurred, his limbs went numb inside the silk restraints, and somewhere near his shoulder, half buried in the webbing, he noticed a cluster of pale, waxy leaves growing straight out of the cavern wall, something the local ecosystem had apparently adapted alongside the spider's venom. He couldn't move his arms. He could still turn his head. It took everything he had to work his mouth close enough to bite down on a leaf, bitter and sharp against his tongue, swallowing what little juice it released before his jaw went slack from the poison's spread. The fire in his veins didn't vanish immediately, but it stopped spreading, and within seconds his limbs answered him again. The Spider Queen, expecting a slowly dying meal wrapped up and helpless, wasn't prepared for her prey to snap the silk restraints and drive a blade clean through the joint of her nearest leg. What followed wasn't a clean, elegant fight. It was closer to butchery, the queen thrashing and spraying acid that ate through stone while Yin Yu Tian worked leg to leg, methodically dismantling something 8 times his size, with the same patient focus he used sorting a junk drawer. By the time she collapsed, the chamber floor was a mess of ichor and shattered webbing, and he stood in the middle of it, breathing hard, checking his own hands for injuries out of habit before checking anything else. The hoard behind her nest held enough raw crystal to fill both his arms twice over, more wealth than an F-ranker was ever supposed to see in one lifetime. He found a narrow exit tunnel on the chamber's far side, one that eventually surfaced near the dungeon's original entrance, and he walked out into daylight, looking like a man who'd survived a landslide, arms loaded with crystal, poison scars fading from his skin. The extraction squad was already gathered at the checkpoint, Lanchimo among them, wiping fake tears while reporting to the coordinator that the new recruit had died in a tragic accident, his body lost somewhere in the tunnel collapse. Grief made her voice tremble just enough to sound convincing. She was still mid-sentence when Yin Yu Tian walked up behind her and set $500,000 in raw magic crystal down on the checkpoint counter, pulled from a storage ring he'd looted off the queen's hoard without a scratch on him. The silence that followed was almost funny, if he'd been the kind of person who noticed things like that. Lanchimo's face went through several stages of disbelief before settling on something close to panic, stammering out a story about miscounting the squad, about assuming he'd fallen behind. Nobody at the checkpoint bought it. The coordinator was already calling it in as an internal incident, the kind that got escalated straight to family leadership. Word reached Fan Sui Shu within the hour, and she personally pulled the mission logs, cross-referencing them against the anchor rope's tension readings and the exact moment Yin Yu Tian's tracker dropped off the grid. The data didn't lie. Someone had shoved him. She didn't have proof yet of who ordered it. She had enough to start asking very pointed questions, questions that made Fan Chunui's carefully maintained calm slip for half a second in a meeting nobody thought to record. Yin Yu Tian, for his part, wasn't particularly interested in the political fallout. He handed in his mission report, deposited his crystal earnings, and went home to reorganize his kitchen cabinets. The whole ordeal already filed away in his mind as a completed task rather than an attempted murder. Wei Wei noticed the poison scars on his arm before he'd even finished explaining what happened, and her reaction wasn't calm at all. She grabbed his wrist hard enough to hurt, demanding to know who pushed him, voice cracking somewhere between fury and fear. He didn't have an answer for her yet. He promised to be more careful, which didn't seem to comfort her even slightly, and she stayed at his apartment that night longer than she needed to, watching him sleep like she expected the ceiling to cave in. His near-death experience, along with the Crystal Hall and the growing rumors about an F-ranker who apparently couldn't die, earned him something he hadn't asked for: an invitation to the Fan family's annual clan tournament, an event usually reserved for hunters with rank and pedigree, thrown open this year to a handful of surprise entries the family wanted to test publicly. The arena sat in the heart of Fan territory, tiered seating rising in a wide circle around a reinforced fighting floor, capable of surviving strikes from hunters well above E rank without cracking. Cameras lined the upper balconies, broadcasting the tournament to viewers across the city. Corporate scouts filled the front rows, watching for talent worth recruiting. Fan Sui-shu sat among them, close enough to the floor to catch every detail. Yin Yu-tian's first match paired him against a confident C-rank candidate, who'd clearly expected an easy win against a listed F-ranker, throwing a heavy opening strike meant to end things fast. It ended fast, just not the way he planned. One counterpunch, delivered with the same clean precision that had shattered a Spider Queen's joints, put the candidate flat on his back before the crowd finished registering the exchange. Gasps rippled through the stands. Somewhere in the scout section, pens started moving fast across notepads. The final match of the day matched him against a name whispered with real caution, a B-rank stealth assassin who fought with a bloodthirsty dagger, a blade that drained stamina from anyone it cut, weakening them with every wound instead of just wounding them outright. The assassin didn't rely on strength. He relied on being unseen, bending light around himself with a cloaking technique few lower-rank hunters had ever encountered. The moment the match began, the assassin vanished from sight entirely, the arena floor empty except for Yin Yu-tian standing alone under the lights, waiting for an attack he couldn't see coming. Most fighters would have panicked, swinging blindly or backing into a defensive crouch. Yin Yu-tian closed his eyes instead, focusing past sight entirely, chasing the faint disturbances in the air itself, the tiny shifts in pressure a moving body left behind even when invisible. Perception threshold breached. Judge title unlocked. He felt the strike coming a half-second before it landed, close enough to sense the exact angle of the blade, and his own sword came up to meet it dead center, steel ringing against steel in front of a crowd that had gone completely silent watching an F-ranker parry an attack he had no visible way of tracking. The assassin, rattled for the first time in the match, dropped the cloak and pressed the advantage with a flurry of strikes designed to bleed stamina fast, opening a shallow cut across Yin Yu-tian's chest that sent a cold, draining weakness crawling through his limbs. He staggered, and for a moment the crowd assumed the fight had turned. Then his hand closed around a small doll-shaped charm at his belt, one of the rewards pulled from the Spider Queen's hoard, and he let the assassin's next strike drive clean through his chest without moving to block it. The blade sank deep. Blood soaked through his shirt in an instant, and half the arena rose out of their seats certain they'd just watched a man die on live broadcast. The wound closed itself half a second later, the doll crumbling to dust against his belt, its stored power flooding back through his body and burning away the stamina drain entirely. The assassin, mid-strike and completely unprepared for his target to still be standing, had no time to pull back before Yin Yu-tian's fist connected with the side of his jaw. The impact sent him sprawling across the arena floor, out cold before he finished sliding to a stop. The crowd's silence broke into a roar loud enough to rattle the upper balconies, scouts scribbling notes so fast half of them dropped their pens, and somewhere in the private box reserved for family leadership, Fan Sui-shu allowed herself something close to a proud smile, quickly hidden behind her hand. Fan Chunui watched from a different section entirely, his expression carefully neutral, though something behind his eyes had gone very still. An F-ranker who couldn't be killed by a push off a cliff, couldn't be poisoned by a boss 3 ranks above him, and now couldn't be beaten by a B-rank assassin in front of every scout in the city, wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. He was a problem that needed solving fast, before Yin Yu-tian's growing reputation made him too valuable to quietly remove. Grappled with missing narrative context and coherence constraints. The tournament win changed things fast. Within days, Yin Yu-tian found himself pulled out of the beginner track entirely and assigned a small office near the family's strategic planning division, a promotion that came with a security badge, a modest salary bump, and access to internal dungeon survey files most low-rank hunters never saw. He didn't ask for the office. He didn't particularly want it either. What he wanted was for the stack of unread onboarding forms on his new desk to stop blinking red in the corner of his vision, so he spent his first afternoon there filling out paperwork with the same grim focus he brought to everything else, unaware he'd just walked into the exact kind of access Fan Chunui needed. The frame worked itself out over the following week, quiet and precise. A set of classified dungeon survey documents, the kind that mapped unclaimed Western territories the Chien family had been trying to get their hands on for years, went missing from a secured server. The access logs, carefully edited beforehand, showed a single set of credentials responsible for the breach. Yin Tian's. He found out about the accusation the same way he found out about most things that didn't involve a floating red notification. Someone told him directly, in this case, a stone-faced security officer who arrived at his apartment with a formal suspension notice and instructions not to leave the city. He read the notice twice, confused less by the accusation itself and more by the timestamp listed, a night he remembered spending entirely at home, reorganizing his bookshelf by height and color. He didn't have proof of that beyond his own certainty, and certainty wasn't evidence. Fan Suishu was the one who delivered the suspension notice in person, which told him immediately this wasn't a routine matter. She stood in his doorway holding the paperwork like it physically pained her to hand it over, explaining that the evidence looked bad enough that even she couldn't simply wave it away without a proper review. She stepped inside while she talked, and within 30 seconds found herself holding a mop, informed in complete seriousness that she couldn't discuss serious matters while standing on a floor, with visible drag marks from her own boots. She stared at the mop, then at him, clearly questioning several of her recent life choices, before actually starting to clean, if only to make him focus enough to have the conversation properly. It was a strange, almost domestic scene for a conversation about corporate espionage. It was also, though neither of them said it aloud, the first time either had let their guard down enough to just exist in the same room without a crisis pressing in from every side. The moment didn't last. Her phone buzzed with an urgent call from building security, and she left in a hurry, promising to sort out the frame-up personally, telling him to stay put and stay out of trouble until she cleared his name. He didn't hear from her again that night. He didn't hear from her the next morning either. By midday, a quiet, cold dread had settled into him that had nothing to do with unfinished tasks. Fan Suishu never went silent for this long, not when she had an active investigation running. He tracked down a junior staffer who'd seen her last, and the story that came back turned his stomach. She'd left the building alone, and somewhere in the parking structure, security footage cut out for exactly 90 seconds. Masked figures, sleeping gas, a van that left through a service exit and hadn't been located since. She'd been taken. He didn't have jurisdiction to launch an official search, didn't have rank, didn't have authority. What he had was a location flagged in the stolen survey documents themselves, an old Arctic cavern system out past the western border, listed as unclaimed and largely unexplored. Whoever had framed him for stealing those files had a reason to want that specific location empty of witnesses. He didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his gear and left before the family's official search teams had even finished their briefing. The western wilderness stretched out in sheets of ice and jagged rock, a landscape that punished anyone without proper cold-weather gear within the first hour. He crossed paths with two solo hunters working the same territory independently. Hai Xian, a quiet, methodical cultivator who specialized in drawing monster aggression away from allies, and Situ Yanua, a sharp-tempered explorer from a rival clan who made it clear she worked alone and had no interest in babysitting an F-ranker. Neither of them knew about the kidnapping. They'd come for a dual-attribute icebird nesting deeper in the cavern system, a boss that had wiped out 2 previous hunting parties. When Yin Yutian explained he was heading into the same territory regardless, injury risk and all, Situ Yanua's disdain softened slightly into grudging respect, the kind reserved for someone too stubborn to talk out of a bad idea. The 3 of them ended up fighting the icebird together almost by accident, cornered in a narrow ravine with no way around it. Situ Yanua's wind techniques and Yin Yutian's borrowed fencing style wove together with a fluid ease that surprised all 3 of them, cutting through the creature's dual-element defenses, while He Xian kept its attention split and scattered. The bird went down clean, feathers scattering across the ice like ash. It should have felt like a victory. Yin Yutian barely registered it, already moving past the frozen carcass toward a set of boot prints in the snow that didn't belong to any hunting party. The tracks led into a stalactite grotto deep in the cavern's belly, air cold enough to hurt his lungs with every breath. He found Fan Sui-shu bound against a support column near the back, unconscious but breathing, a thin layer of frost already forming on her eyelashes. He'd barely reached her restraints when the patriarch of the Fan family, Fan Dong, came storming into the grotto from the opposite tunnel, having tracked the kidnapping through his own private channels far faster than family security managed. The old man took one look at his daughter tied up and an F-ranker crouched beside her, and drew the only conclusion that made sense to a father operating on pure panic, that this was the kidnapper, caught red-handed. He didn't wait for an explanation. Fandong's hands closed around Yin Yutian's throat with strength that shouldn't have belonged to a man his age, the kind of raw, awakened power that came from decades as an S-rank hunter, lifting him clean off the ground. Yin Yutian didn't fight back. Some part of him recognized grief and fear when he saw it, even filtered through violence, and he let the old man choke him half unconscious rather than risk hurting Sui-shu's father in front of her. The strain proved too much for Fandong's own body. A genetic illness he'd hidden from the public for years, something eating slowly at his heart, flared under the exertion, and his grip faltered as his knees buckled. That was the opening Fan Chunui had been waiting for. He stepped out from the grotto's shadows, where he'd been watching the entire confrontation unfold exactly as planned, a faint smile settling on his face as he raised both hands toward his adoptive father's exposed back. Beams of concentrated fire tore through Fandong from behind, the old man's body arching in silent, shocked agony before he collapsed face-first into the snow, smoke rising from the wound. The smile never left Fan Chunui's face. He straightened, addressing Yin Yutian directly for what felt like the first time, dropping every pretense of loyalty he'd worn for years inside the Fan household. He wasn't Fan Chunui at all, not really. He was Qian Yun, planted inside the family as a child by the rival Qian Corporation, patient enough to wait a decade for a moment exactly like this one. The frame-up, the stolen documents, the assassination attempts, all of it traced back to one goal: clearing every obstacle between himself and a Fan corporation stripped for parts by the family that had actually raised him from birth. He gestured toward the grotto's ceiling, thick with unstable ice and stalactites the size of support beams, and told Yin Yutian this cave would make a fitting grave for all three of them. An unfortunate accident nobody would ever trace back to him. The ceiling groaned, cracks spreading fast under some hidden trigger Qian Yun had planted earlier that day. Yin Yutian didn't have time to process the betrayal properly, didn't have time to grieve the father figure bleeding out in the snow beside him. He grabbed the decoy doll charm at his belt, the last one he had left, and threw himself directly at Qian Yun's chest as the first support column gave way overhead. The impact should have shattered something. Instead, the doll's stored power flared to life on contact, absorbing the worst of a follow-up fire blast meant to finish him off, and Yin Yutian tackled Qian Yun bodily away from the collapsing ceiling, buying just enough space to drag both Fandong and Sui-shu clear of the falling ice. Qian Yun recovered fast, clearly having trained for exactly this kind of close combat, his hands crackling with heat as he unleashed wave after wave of fire meant to finish the fight before backup could arrive. Yin Yutian burned through the doll's charges, tanking hit after hit, his shirt smoking, skin blistering in places, refusing to go down even as the cavern shook around them. By the time the last charge ran dry, something in his system flared past its usual limits, the same desperate edge-of-death trigger that had cracked open an undead general's skull weeks earlier. Inner strength surging, threshold exceeded. His fist connected with Qian Yun's jaw in a single strike, carrying every ounce of power his body had left, the traitor's head snapping back hard enough to crack against the stone wall behind him. Qian Yun crumpled, unconscious before he finished sliding down the rock face, the fire in his hands sputtering out into nothing. The cavern's collapse slowed to a groaning stop, the worst of the ceiling having already come down around the fight instead of on top of it. Yin Yutian dropped to his knees beside Fandong, pressing what little first aid he carried against a wound that looked far too serious for field treatment. Sui-shu stirred awake into a scene of wreckage, her father barely breathing, the man who'd raised her family's most trusted lieutenant lying unconscious a few feet away, and an F-ranker covered in burns holding what remained of the group together through sheer stubbornness. Word reached Wei Wei faster than anyone expected. Some quiet channel of hers Yin Yutian had never fully understood, and she arrived at the grotto with a set of restoration techniques far beyond anything a normal civilian should have access to. Techniques she'd apparently kept hidden for years, for exactly this kind of emergency. Whatever the full story behind her abilities was, now wasn't the time to ask. She worked fast, stabilizing Fandong's heart rate enough to survive transport, her hands steady despite the fear plain on her face. The old patriarch survived. Barely. In the weeks that followed, with Qian Yun's betrayal fully exposed and the Qian family's covert leak thoroughly documented, Fandong stepped back from daily operations to recover, formally naming his daughter as the corporation's new chief executive. Suishu's first act in the role was appointing Yin Yutian as her deputy, a decision that raised eyebrows across every level of the company, an F-ranker suddenly holding more authority than hunters who'd served for a decade. He didn't fully understand the politics of it. He understood that a stack of new administrative files needed organizing, and that gave his hands something to do while the rest of him processed everything the past few weeks had cost. The two of them spent the following days mapping out an expansion into the unclaimed Western territories, plotting the most efficient route through terrain neither of them had fully explored, unaware that the true owner of that wilderness had already noticed their scouting reports. Deep beneath the ice, in a military research facility that didn't appear on any public map, an S-rank commander named Gaboni reviewed the same reports with far less patience, already deploying cybernetic assets and elite hunters to make sure nobody stumbled onto what his labs had spent years building in secret. Neither Yin Yutian nor Sui Shu had any idea they were about to walk directly into it.